Hello, my name's Sai Kamal. I'm the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The following is one of a series of webinars produced by the IA. In this video, I'm in conversation with Grover Norquist, who's the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform. And in this video, he discusses with us freedom versus security, security at any cost. He also touches on more issues than just security and talks about the politics and economics of the war on COVID. I hope you find it interesting.
Let's take a look in the United States at where we were when the virus started to hit and our government started to react to it, or governments, federal and the 50 states. We had the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We had turned around an economy that had the weakest growth during the Obama recovery. From when the economy began to recover 6 months into Obama's presidency, for 7.5 years, the economy grew. Weakest recovery in modern history since World War II. Compare it to the Reagan years, and we would have had 10 million more Americans at work and much higher GDP. Because of that weakness, the country was rather grumpy, elected Trump, and we took our corporate rate from 35 down to 21. If you remember, we used to have the highest corporate rate in the world. Communist China at 25, we were at 35. France had a lower corporate income tax in the United States, not where you want to be. And we expensed all business investment for the next 5 years. We want to make that permanent, but for 5 years, all Americans got a rate cut. The per-child tax credit was doubled, and the president started deregulating everything that moved. So you had both a significant Reagan-style deregulation and a pro-growth tax cut policy. And you saw the economy grow, wages were growing much higher than in the past, and particularly the lower income brackets saw their wages increase more than not. This was going to be how Trump got reelected. This was going to be the politics that the Democrats would have to face going into November. Then COVID, the world changed. And this is where both parties, both political tendencies in the United States, are each trying to get their arms around how they respond to COVID in order to change policy in their own direction and to win the election in November. And so the most important thing for the Trump people and for Republicans is not to make any permanent damage to the economy. There are some temporary challenges. Everything that's shut down in the United States, airlines, bars, restaurants, hotels, did so because the government had policies to say you can't run a bar for the next month. You can't run a restaurant for the next month. You can't fly on planes. And the entire collapse of the employment levels and the growth of unemployment and the GDP drop, which is worst since the Great Depression, was all man-made, but government-made. It was a government policy. It wasn't too much inventory. It wasn't even a trade war, although that didn't help from where we were. And so when the advantage that the advocates of returning to normalcy have is if you simply take the government's foot off the economy's throat, it should spring back. And what slows that down? Biggest mistake that's been made so far was the administration signed a bill that the Democrats came up with, which adds $600 every week to the unemployment payments already scheduled by the 50 states. Most states will cover half of your salary up to a certain cap, but half, up to like 60,000 or so, half of what you were making is paid in unemployment for X number of weeks. What was added to that was an additional $600 per week, regardless of what your income was, until August 1st. The challenge there is that in most states, if you were making $64,000 a year or less, you are as well off on unemployment or significantly better than before. By not working, you're actually as well or better off until August 1st. So a couple of things are happening in terms of freeing up the economy. The president said, after listening to the experts, want everything shut down because they're looking at one metric only, which is number of COVID deaths. And then they changed the metric to how many people have been tested, even though the point of testing people was to keep the deaths and the infections down. We bent the curve down where we never hit the point where anyone walked into a hospital in the United States and said, I have COVID, I need a respirator, and they said, oh, there are 10 of you with 5 respirators. That choice never faced anyone in the United States. We heard that it did in some other countries. It terrified Americans. And so we went to work building many, many, many of the respirators and the face coverings and all the things that you need so that you never get swamped. We're past being swamped. That isn't happening. Now we're in this interesting position where the metric that some in the media or the Democrats want to use is whether everybody's been tested. Well, the point of testing was to know whether you're going to be swamped in any particular area. We're past that. Probably a good idea to test, and because it's easier to let people know if you've had the antibodies, you can go out more and not necessarily have a challenge. But the thing that we were trying to avoid, the decision of whether you can come in the hospital or not, because we've only got so much room in the manor, it's no, we've passed that. So now we're having this fascinating political and economic fight where the president, I think, is wisely from a constitutional point of view, said the 50 states will decide how to open up, whether they legalize bars for half of the former patrons, or you can go to restaurants, but only outdoors, and take it step by step to minimize transmission. People are wearing masks. I'm in Washington, D.C., and they want you to wear a mask to go into any store, many of which are open because they do essential things. So we now go from now to the election. Biggest challenge is, will people go back to work? And we're hearing from restaurants that they've called their workers. The workers, I'd rather not go. And in New Jersey, when you sign up for unemployment, it tells you right there, if you are looking for work and you've been offered work, you don't have to take it if you're scared of COVID or if you're worried about it. And in other states, their position is Iowa and Nebraska, the governors have said, you get a call from your employer, you go back to work. Otherwise, we're cutting off your unemployment, state unemployment and federal. So as states react differently, and they're going to have a real experiment here in the United States, 50 states, some gentle coverage from the federal government saying, okay, let's stay within some boundaries here. But otherwise, states are really free to make the decisions they want. And in states like Iowa and Nebraska, you don't show up for work, your employer calls and says, I told them that they were invited back, you're off. So in some states, they won't wait till August. But in other states, until that extra 600 a week disappears, you'll have a slow growth of people returning back to work. So watch for that. Watch for August 1st, all of August, all of September, all of October. There'll be a boom in hiring as people who'd waited decide to come back to work. And so we'll be going into an election in November with every day, every week, every month, new numbers of people going back to work. So the politics of this is very interesting. A lot of unemployment right now, a lot of grumpiness right now, uncertainty. August forward, you're going to see some dramatic increases in employment. We'll see some states may begin to get that sooner. So what are the two parties trying to do? And we really have divided into the two camps here. The administration's position, the Republican, the free market position is no permanent damage, no permanent tax increase. When we fought the Spanish-American War, because Spain so viciously attacked us back in 1898, if you remember, that was a very brief war. But the tax to pay for it on phones, on long-distance lines, lasted more than 100 years. When Jonestown, Pennsylvania was destroyed because a dam broke above the city and it largely wiped it out, they passed a tax on liquor to rebuild Jonestown. And that was more than 100 years ago. And to this day, today, tomorrow, the next day, they're still paying that tax in Pennsylvania. So any tax increase brought in to pay for fighting coronavirus will be here long after anybody can pronounce coronavirus or remembers what it was. So largely we've avoided that at the federal level. Watch for the fight in 50 states. And a lot of the Republican governors have started off with, we're not raising taxes, we're going to rein in spending, and we'll see how that plays out also for the election. The other change that people are trying to watch out for is Nancy Pelosi has today released her list of demands for a several $trillion spending program. She wants to take $1 trillion and give them to incompetent governors who have misspent money over the last 20 years, and to the corrupt big cities who have also misgoverned, and bail out failure to reward failure and encourage more of it in the future. And then there are a series of the previous efforts. She has asked for the Green New Deal to be put inside. She's asked for vote by mail, which allows Americans to vote by mail. There are quite a number of Americans who don't live in the same place anymore, but the letter goes to where they used to vote. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are on the voting records, but there's no person there. The person has moved to Florida. The person has passed away. If they all get letters, the people who do live there, and the postal union, which delivers all these letters to people who don't live there anymore, would have a collection of people who could vote in the election. Massive opportunities for voter fraud, significant challenges. This is one of the things that Nancy Pelosi very much wants to solve the virus problem. Now, in the United States, people are going to stores. They're just standing 6 feet away from each other. You can go vote standing 6 feet behind somebody else in a line there. We don't need vote by mail for any health reasons. We're also seeing a divide that might expect. Democratic governors are shutting down churches, synagogues, and mosques, saying, yeah, you can only have 10 people show up in a church, regardless of whether the church is organized for 1,000. I was talking to somebody at a Catholic church, 1,200 people. They're told in New Jersey, you can only have 10 show up. Not go in and six feet apart and promise not to shake the pastor's hand on the way out, but shut down. And this is now playing out as a First Amendment fight. The governor of the great state of Michigan announced you cannot drive from your home in your own car to your house on the lake. Now, there's no health question there. You're all alone in your house with your family. You're all alone in your family in the car. You're all alone with your family in your house. No, that's illegal. That's go to jail, illegal in the state of Michigan. Other places, they've arrested people for boating in the middle of a lake or for exercising in the middle of an empty park. Because of these overstatements by government, it'll be interesting to see whether there's a backlash. There was a fear at first that if the death rate got too high, every failure to clamp down everything would be punished. And we've gotten sort of over that hump, and we're now having discussions about over-regulation. The left is arguing that the government is the font of all innovation, new piece out by the Ralph Nader type people, news to some of us, but that was their position. If you actually look at what's working in the United States, Amazon's delivering everything you could want to your home, and other groups like it. You can get all the food you want delivered straight to your home without a problem. The lines of getting materials back and forth in the private sector are all working. The challenges we have, they can't do our taxes, so they're saying go ahead and file them later. Well, that's the IRS and the government. We've actually had, and at our website, atr.org/rules, R-U-L-E-S, there's a list of, last I looked, 435 regulations that have been ended or suspended because they got in the way of fighting the virus. We started with the CDC, which wanted to be in charge of all testing. That got taken away from them. Now lots of different groups are coming up with various tests. The FDA wanted all sorts of approvals that slow things down that normally nobody notices. People die as a result of those slowdowns, but not in numbers and in the same place, so you don't notice. It was noticeable. And just as with AIDS, they said, hey, all those rules you got, shorten them. And so they're speeding things up. The folks at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, have something they think is a vaccine. They think it works. They're putting it through the approval process. It'll take till September to approve it. They're building it now. They're manufacturing it now, because then they'll have millions when the government gets around to approving what they think works. This may speed up if Pfizer's are correct that it really works. But right now, Pfizer's, we'll get around to it, to approve it in the fourth quarter. So when I say September, I'm after September is the government's number. We've seen more deregulation and more odd regulations exposed. Texas, illegal up until a few months ago to deliver liquor, alcohol, and groceries in the same truck, in the back of the truck, so the groceries don't get drunk. I don't know. There's some law somebody put in once to advantage somebody, and since you make hand sanitizer out of alcohol, this was a problem. On TSA used to grab your hand sanitizer if it was more than 3 or 4 ounces. They moved that up to 12 because they want to encourage hand sanitizers, not discourage it. When you cross from one state to another as a doctor, it could take you quite some time. You can't just bop across the border and help somebody and then go back, New Hampshire to Massachusetts. Massachusetts does. We got it down to 24 hours to get your license from another state recognized. I guess that's progress, but your marriage license, your driver's license, they don't stop you at the border and see if your wife and you can still get along. They don't stop you at the border and ask you to just drive around and parallel park for us before we let you drive in New York, because it's different than in Vermont. There is a movement now to allow all medical professionals to practice across all 50 states. And that is something that I think you'll see more of in the next, as this moves forward beyond the coronavirus. So this is right now, and Chuck, Mr. DeMuth, who used to run the AEI, American Enterprise Institute, wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal saying this is the first crisis where the first impetus has been deregulation. Now, yes, but he said, well, what about all these little Roman emperors as governors who are making these bizarre decisions on what's essential and what's not? In blue states, buying a gun is not essential. In red states, it certainly is. And we've seen gun sales go through the roof because people know the police are busy doing other things, and you've got more people buying weapons and ammunition. But in blue states, they're literally saying not essential. It's in the First Amendment, it's in the Second Amendment, but it's not essential. So you've got this bizarre sense, both how they treat churches, how they treat guns, how they treat various activities, banning protests, okay, which is also in the First Amendment, assemblies. There have been this bizarre, but all of those laws that allowed those overreaches have been there for years. Some of them were strengthened during September 11th, the reaction to the attack on September 11th. And they gave governors and the president weird and outrageous powers. I think you'll see a culling back of that. I was talking to the state senator from a Republican state who's collecting all the outrageous things blue states did, and they're going to amend their emergency law, this is one of the larger states, to say, in an emergency, here's what the governor cannot do. All the things that other governors have done that go too far. You saw that in the reaction to the Louisiana floods, where they flooded, and in New Orleans, they sent police out to people who are on little islands, and they said to them, we're here, by the way, we understand you have a gun, and they take their gun, and they go away. They didn't bring them food, they didn't bring the medicine, they didn't say hi, they just go, the police were spending their time going away, taking away guns from people who were isolated. Louisiana, when that crisis passed a law. That never happens again. A dozen other states passed laws. That never happens if there's ever an emergency here. So there's already a backlash forming on what oversteps the governors took that they won't be allowed to do in the future. So we could end up with less government and less intrusive government because of that. And I'll leave with 2 other things that I think are going to be the biggest takeaways. The first is, I have 2 daughters, 11 and 12. They go to a charter school here in DC, Washington, DC. And so they're home for this entire semester. So half of the school year, they're home. And they're doing, in fact, distance learning. They work on the computer. The teachers send them stuff by computer. They work on it, their own schedule. And parents are home, and so you have homeschooling with kids, with some online learning. And all of a sudden, half the people in that school, by the way, aren't teachers. They're administrators and other things in many US schools. And parents are learning, I could do some of this through homeschooling. 2 million Americans homeschool now, 2 million. That's about 3 to 4% of all the kids from K through 12. 35 years ago in the United States, it was go to jail, illegal to homeschool in 48 states. 48 states, illegal. It's now legal in all 50 states. They win all the spelling bees, they go to Harvard, they win the Emmys recently, they become big football stars. So the social stigma on homeschooling is not there. but it's also people don't know if they can do it. Well, we just got tens of millions of parents, hundreds of millions of parents, 100 plus millions of parents who experienced homeschooling for a semester, and some of them might homeschool. And if 1% of those guys moved, you would see a 50% increase in homeschooling. So watch for more homeschooling. Teachers' unions are trying to kill it. The other is not K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, but universities. Right now, Harvard, Yale, MIT, University of Michigan, all sent letters to parents paying for their kids. We're not going to charge you for this semester for food because your kid's at home not eating here. We're not going to charge you for your dormitory because you're not sleeping here. But we're going to charge you the same dollar amount for an education online that we were paying for you with our hyper-paid professors in person. So Harvard has told you, and state colleges have told you, and every college in the United States has told parents, you just as good an education online as you do in person with the best professors that they think they have in the world. Do the younger siblings spend $60,000+ a year going to a university, or perhaps do they in whole or in part do distance learning, online learning? And a company like Starbucks has already said, if you're a barista, if you work at Starbucks for a year or more, they will pay to give you a 4-year degree at Arizona State University, which is online. So you can do it when you're not working. You don't have to take time off from work. You do weekends, evenings, mornings. And millions of Americans have begun to move towards online universities. And now everybody's had the experience of, for 1/8 of their college existence, 4 years college, half of 1 year, 1/8 of their college, they were doing distance online learning. I think that puts tremendous pressure on any college charging more, and tremendous pressure on people can opt out and go online, and none of your employers will say, that's weird. They'll go, oh, I did that. I know what that is. I think culturally, education is the big shift because we've actually allowed technology to progress a little bit past Socrates, which hadn't happened until just recently. So the economy will start to get much better in August. We'll see how much it improves now. I do not believe there'll be any deal in the United States which gives Nancy Pelosi all of the crazy stuff she wants, because there's nothing good enough that would be helpful to the economy to counteract the damage of what she wants to do.
Well, thank you very much, Grover. That was great. That was a typical, that's why we invite you here, typically comprehensive and provocative at the same time. Before I open for questions and answers, let me just remind you, if you want to ask questions, please go to the Q&A function, move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that pop up. If you don't want to ask a question, but I'd like you to help me out here, could you go to the Q&A function anyway and maybe vote on your favorite question, and that will help me decide which questions to ask and in which order. And if we could do that, that would be really helpful. Interestingly, some of the things that Grover mentioned there in terms of sort of the economic impact, the IA recently released a briefing paper by Steve Davis on the history and economics of pandemics. I'll ask one of my colleagues to put a link to that in the chat function if you're interested in reading that. But Grover, you start off by saying that all this sort of reduction in economic activity is government mandated. Yeah, I get that. The EIA is a classical liberal think tank. We're free marketeers. We believe in all that. We have a natural suspicion of government. But these are unusual times. And what we're finding here is even people who are normally skeptical of government involvement or government intervention are given the government the benefit of the doubt during these times because people are worried about the COVID virus and catching it, and they understand that there has to be things like herd immunity or social distancing, and how you find, what's your reaction to that? We say, well, hold on, Grove, aren't you being a bit unfair on government here? These are unusual times. People do look to government in these difficult times.
They do. That's how we got in the mess we're in, because every time there was a crisis, Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff for Obama and became mayor of Chicago, said at one point, referring to the financial crisis of Fannie and Freddie, two government institutions, and then the law that was passed regulated all the banks except Fannie and Freddie. So he said, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, what's a good crisis? good crisis. A good crisis. A good crisis is one that you can exploit. And he's not alone. James Madison in 1894, in a letter to Jefferson, so I don't think they were arguing, quote, "The old trick of turning every contingency into a resource for accumulating force in government." The old trick. It was an old trick in 1794 to yell crisis, and then everybody ducks, and the government says, we're going to do this, but it's a crisis, which means you don't have time to think about it. We don't have time to discuss it. And things like constitutional rights are really kind of flexible, aren't they? There's a crisis. You say First Amendment, I say crisis. You say Second Amendment, I say crisis. And if you shout crisis loud enough, nobody, when September 11th happened and they knocked down the trade towers, about 3 weeks after that, I testified in the Senate hearing against passing the entirety of the Patriot Act, apart from suggesting that anything that has to be called a Patriot Act is a problem, okay? Otherwise, you could call it something else, right? But Patriot Act, you can't oppose, so Patriot Act. Emergency. I said, my suggestion is that you all read this bill before you vote for it. And all the senators laughed. All the senators laughed. I said, I know, you're not going to read it because you're terrified that if a bomb goes off in 2 weeks, you'll be blamed because you didn't vote for something that you haven't read. And which is true, you would, okay? My suggestion was pass it for 3 years. Pass the whole thing for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, let it lapse and then decide this was a good idea, this was a really bad idea, and this we're not so sure about. But they did a little of that last part. But not just people are giving the state the benefit of that. Elected officials defer to the state. The state wants more power. Feed the state. All crises are viewed as demanding that, which is why it's so cheerful that in this crisis, the actual problems we ran up against were idiot, stupid government rules that got in the way of doing what needed to be done. And the FDA, we recently had a fight in the United States. The Food and Drug Administration takes X number, it can take 5 years to decide something's safe, a new drug, and then another 4 or 5 years to decide it's effective. You used to only have to test for safe, but because you guys screwed up on some drug a while ago, everybody in the United States had to do something, so it has to prove it's effective too. Okay, and so now it takes much longer. And what was passed as a law in 40 states and then in Washington was, once the FDA says it's safe, it's legal in this state. If you have a terminal disease, we're not going to wait around for another 4 years and after your funeral and okay something because it's effective. If it's safe, you can try it, you can have it. And now we pass that at the federal level as well. That speeds up the process. COVID is a fatal disease.
Okay, well, we've got about 28 minutes. We've got about 16 questions. So I'll have to ask people who are watching if they can help me out by voting for the questions. Let's go to the questions. First one is from an anonymous attendee. How do you think the security concern related to China will map out in terms of freedom, economic, national, and personal freedoms in the US and other Western countries?
When Trump got elected, there was an unhappiness about China the way there was an unhappiness about Japan when Reagan came in. There was a sense that they're selling things inexpensively and we've got a deficit in our trade deficit with them. This is a problem. And also they're not letting us sell into the country in a fair way. With the Chinese, they're stealing our intellectual property, in addition to the questions of allowing us to compete on a level basis and some unfair competition on the way in. So there was a hostility there, largely based on trade, largely based on the lousy economy we had in the United States. Now, and now that China's kind of stepping on all of its neighbors and being a little aggressive militarily, and that they didn't level with us on this has led to conspiracy theories that they did on purpose, as opposed to they spilled something in the middle of China, which got out. I mean, it looks to me as though because they have a police state, they didn't want to tell anybody about their problem until it was too late. I don't think they did it on purpose, but who knows? And that has led to some unhappiness, and all anti-China sentiment, for whatever reason, trade, foreign policy, defense, the way they treat the rest of the world, the way they deal with dictators and make friends with them in ways that we're not allowed to, all has raised the animus towards China. Biden has a history of China's not a problem, we're not afraid of China, and things where his Democratic president did things to help China out that maybe were not wise. Trump's always had an animus towards China. So as you go into the election, that's not helpful to Biden, and it is a little helpful to Trump, even if some of it's protectionism.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question from Mark Littlewood. You may have heard of him. He's actually my boss at the IA.
Yes.
Is the crisis likely to strengthen or weaken federalism? Are Americans expecting a stronger centralized lead from Washington, D.C., or keen to pursue different approaches at state level? It was interesting what you said about the 50 different experiments. Because, for example, in Europe, we have Germany, it's got the federal level, they're able to do that. In the UK, we've got very much a centralized control. And even where we have the sort of four home nations, as it were, the leaders of those have been complaining, saying they don't want to go their own way, or sometimes they do when it suits them. What they say, no, we must have a uniform solution, except when we disagree. What do you think in terms of federalism? Will it strengthen or weaken federalism?
Oh, I think it's a tremendous boon to federalism, because the governors are out there becoming famous, talking about what they're doing. So governors feel that and the governors are all more popular today than before because they're on TV more, they're out there talking, but they're not saying the same thing. Some governors are going, we must open up quick, 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 and others going, I don't know, we're worried, don't open up. I think we are going to move faster to open up because of federalism, because some will move ahead and show that the ice is thick enough to keep walking on, and others lagging behind will have lousier employment numbers and other challenges and unhappiness about some of the restrictions. Because we've had 50 different experiments doing 50 different things, we'll be able to look back and learn better what works, what was completely unnecessary. And you don't want to be one of those governors who did 12 completely unnecessary things that didn't make health any better. So it'll make we learn better with 50 competitors than one monopoly. And I think people will say, I'm glad I live in a state that didn't do crazy things, or, you know what, I'm glad that other states were able to move forward and convince. I was on a conference call like this with the New Jersey folks today, and they're waiting for Texas and Florida to do it right. And then a couple months later, they think their idiot governor will get around to doing something useful.
Wonderful competition at the local level. Next question, Edgar Warner. President Trump promised to cancel 2 regulations for every new one. How many has he removed per new one?
More than 2. I always thought that was an odd question because some regulations cost more than others. The number is kind of an odd choice. But in terms of dollar amounts, there's been tremendous liberalization, and estimating when you get the government out of the way, how much you really free up we always understate the value of that, because all you can see is the things you can think of. You completely miss all the other stuff that flows from getting rid of a bottleneck. You get rid of a bottleneck, it's not just, it's not just that bottleneck, it's everything that connects to the bottleneck. And some of these regulations, 16 of them are gone forever, ever, ever, because they were done by the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, which means if you get the House and Senate and the President to sign a law undoing a regulation, it can only be put back with the House, the Senate, and the President. Nothing that looks like it can be put back by regulators in the future. Now, when we do deregulate something, it takes a long time to re-regulate it if you wanted to. And with success, you don't necessarily want to go back to something that you now know wasn't necessary. So I think the deregulation has been very helpful, very good, and will be long lasting despite the left's antipathy towards it when it passed.
Okay, next question. Kelsey Polden, thank you for joining us, Kelsey. Can you discuss the economic impact of the massive government debt announced to fund various recovery-related packages in terms of tax, deflation, trade, and budgetary implications, etc.?
The budget deficit in the United States is too large. It is a symptom of spending too much money. I'm concerned about total spending, not just the debt, but the debt is a measure of how much more the government's willing to spend, this much more than it's willing to take from you, which shows it understands the damage that it's doing. Debt is a temporary challenge because it happens once. A tax increase of the same size gives you money every year into the future forever. So if you told me we need $1 billion, we have to have $1 billion, I'd much rather borrow it than raise taxes $1 billion that would do this forever, forever, forever.
Okay, next question. Gintas, by the way, Grover, we've lost you, you visually, but we can still hear you. I've noticed a major change in the COVID policy objectives that nobody seems to be commenting on. This may be UK specific, but maybe you can comment from your end. The mission appears to have changed from keep the peak low enough so as not to overwhelm the NHS or the health service while the country acquires herd immunity to let's make sure that most people never get COVID, in which case herd immunity will never be achieved. What conclusions would you draw from that fact that this shift took place and that it happened in such a stealthy manner?
I think there's some governors who think that Caligula is a role model, and they just love this idea of all this accumulated power. And the idea that even though they said we're only doing this temporarily, they didn't realize how much fun it is to be the center of attention, to be on TV every day and the press asks you, Mother, may I? Is this going to happen? Can I do this? Am I allowed to do? Well, I'll think about it. And I got two quotes here. One from Governor of California, okay, not an insignificant state. Quote, there is an opportunity for reimagining a more progressive era as it relates to capitalism. So yes, absolutely. We see this as an opportunity to reshape the way we do business and how we govern. They're not talking about laws. They're not talking about a national discussion. They see the power they have as a way to re-implement things. Majority Whip James Clyburn, Majority Whip, big deal in the US House of Representatives, Democrat. This is a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. Whoa, Nelly. I know who that guy is. I know what his vision is. They and mayors who really do see themselves as little emperors, and the real harassing, annoying regulations happen at the local level where you're the king of everything and you decide whether somebody can fix their house or build a new business or all the permits you need to get to do anything locally. So we are looking at a certain number of politicians, not all, who love this moment of power and don't want it to go away. So they have, in the States, they call move the goalposts to, oh, did we just want to stop us from outstripping our healthcare capacity? No, the new thing is, and I've heard many, many different definitions of what winning would be. When there's never again anyone with COVID, when we have a vaccine, of course, you can delay the vaccine through the FDA as long as you want. A vaccine that we like, I don't know, a vaccine that's 100% and never hurts anyone. Well, that'll never happen. You can redefine the end of this crisis and take it out into infinity, into the horizon. And the reason why the 50 states are so important is there will be cities, Austin and New York City will be out there acting like little dictatorships, and the rest of the country will be passing them by. And, you know.
It plays the old saying, doesn't never waste a good crisis.
Yes, that's why crises are good. Crises are good because you can use them to do all this stuff.
Right, so next question from an anonymous attendee. In the European Union, the left and centrist parties are pushing for a political recovery where financing is predicated on quote unquote sustainable investment. How do you think the US will handle the drive from the left for any recovery to be a green recovery?
Well, they're hoping that Trump wants something in a piece of legislation between now and the election so much that he will give them everything they're asking for. The president has said we're not going to bail out failure in the past. California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York want to be backfilled because they have these unfunded pension liabilities and unfunded retirement liabilities, healthcare and pensions. That'll never get fixed. The rest of us are trying to make sure that it's legal for states to go bankrupt. The reason cities every once in a while go bankrupt, like Detroit, is that they were just on a trajectory to collapse. And finally, if they do go bankrupt, you can sell off everything they own and pay off people and then renegotiate the contracts that got you in the trouble in the first place. Like a business, like a multi-billion-dollar business. It's not, it's a good idea for somebody to go bankrupt rather than go to debtor's prison. So there'll be a fight in the states between those of us who want states to be allowed to go bankrupt so that it'll also teach you, don't lend money to crazy states. They can go bankrupt. They will go bankrupt. And they should be reminded that when Argentina goes bankrupt every once in a while, it slows down the whole process of loaning money to bad governments in Latin America.
A related question to the question just now about the green recovery, for want of a better phrase, is will the Green New Deal win the politics if unemployment remains high?
No, the good news is everything about the Green New Deal makes your energy more expensive, your jobs less likely, it slows the economy down. Matter of fact, you can hear the environmentalists on TV going, isn't this great? There's so much less carbon in the air because nobody's driving cars, because nobody's going to work. And they're talking about how wonderful this is in a time of massive unemployment and wages that have disappeared. The Green New Deal is wildly unpopular if you give people a hint of how expensive it is, how much it costs, and what it simply does to the price of gasoline. That's one of the things that people get immediately because they buy gasoline regularly. They pay for it right there. You can get confused about sales taxes because they're a little every day. How do you add them up in a year? Every week what you put into your tank and how much it costs. And we dropped the cost of gasoline in the United States quite a bit before this recent drop, simply by having more fracking and more drilling offshore, on federal land, on private land. And that's made life easier for middle income and lower income people. And the Ds want to push those costs back up again. That is an incredible loser. Hillary Clinton got a memo from her campaign manager in 2016 about the tax on energy, the carbon tax. And they said, all the polling on this sucks. All the polling on this sucks. Don't touch it. And Biden has endorsed it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, this reminds me, what my colleague Andy Mayer actually wrote a blog on the issue of suspending the dual duty. Hopefully one of our colleagues will put a link to that in the chat. Next question from Oliver Hilton. Oliver, thanks very much for joining us this evening. What are your thoughts on the prospects of an equitable trade agreement with the UK in the current circumstances and the speed with which one might be achieved?
And I'm surprised that wasn't ready at the beginning, that Cato and Heritage and you guys hadn't sat down and written it and handed it to the two governments when they got done. I think in the United States, because the two countries are sufficiently similar, there isn't some sense that you've got bizarrely different wage levels or anything else along those lines, that it should be easy. Between now and the election, no, because the Democrats won't do anything to make Trump look good between now and the election. But I would think it'd be, of all the trade deals we could do, that would be one of the simplest, the easiest. People have a sense of what Britain is and where it is on the map as opposed to most other countries. And that should be not easy, but easier than any other trade deal, and one the president's own protectionist proclivities wouldn't get in the way of.
Yeah, you say that. In fact, there were a coalition of free market think tanks who did write a template deal. Hopefully someone will put that into the chat for us. At the same time, the IA is more generally writing about the future trade relations with the rest of the world. For the UK, we wrote a book called Plan A+, post-Brexit trade agreements. And I will also ask one of my colleagues to put that into a chat function for others who are watching tonight. Next question from Adam Barter, who is director of the Epicenter Network of Free Market Think Tanks. He says, preliminary data from Sweden indicates that their economy suffered just as much without lockdowns as the economy of neighboring countries that adopted lockdown measures. Do you think we are overestimating the impact of lifting lockdowns? Isn't it possible that individuals will consciously continue to social distance, consume less, travel less, etc., thereby the economy will not rebound that quickly just because the lockdowns are lifted?
I think that there's certainly certain sectors of the economy. I'm not sure I'd want to be in the travel business or cruise ships or vacation spots that, because those are places people may decide not to travel to. They may wait and see how everybody else does. Get the canaries down in the mine shaft to let you know if it's safe. Certainly what will happen is I think prices there will fall sufficiently that people will begin to travel more. And then when people feel that that's safe, it should speed up. If we do get the vaccine around September or so, as Pfizer seems to think, and there may be other companies. I'm not doing an ad for Pfizer. They presented on what they've done so far, and I know other people are looking to do this. Other countries have got things they think might be vaccines or cures. I think the day will come when you hit, this is no longer more scary than the regular flu, and that we're moving forward. But there's an awful lot of the economy that people can go to work. They're going to go to bars and restaurants a lot sooner than they'll fly to Tahiti because of cost. But so certain parts of travel, I think, will be hit.
Great. We've got about 9 questions in about 11 minutes. Let's see let's see how well we can do. I know you and I can try and do this. Richard Parsonson, we may have covered this part of this question. How do you think US-China relations will play out following the COVID crisis, and will this be an issue in the election?
It'll be ugly, and it'll be a major issue in the election. Yes.
Okay. And major dividing line between the two?
Yep. Biden has always been pro-China, and the president's always been a critic. Biden made a mistake.
Okay. This brings us to the next question from an anonymous attendee. Will Trump win the US presidential election?
50-50.
Okay. Do you want to say any more than that?
Well, it's completely doable. I mean, he gave us an incredibly good economy, judges that are just absolutely amazing, deregulation that's very helpful. Whatever fears people had didn't, all the things he was supposed to do that were horrible. And he's running against a guy who's completely inarticulate, doesn't seem to be able to handle a simple speech very easily. And as Robert Gates, who was defense secretary under Obama, said, he's been on the wrong side of every foreign policy in American history. And that's from a friend. Biden didn't want to shoot Osama bin Laden. I mean, imagine, when you look at this guy's record, he announced before he ran, he was the most progressive Democrat running, of all the people running. That's when Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were in the race. And when Obama endorsed him, he said he's the most progressive guy ever to run for president. So he's painted himself way far left corner. Trump bothers some people, but if you weren't bothered by him before, you're not additionally bothered. And there's some people who go, he's not as scary as I thought he was. That last one was close. The next one will be close.
Interesting. When I was speaking to classical liberals, libertarians who are American last election, some of them voted for Trump holding their nose. Since then, they said, well, he's been great on taxes. He's been great on the Supreme Court. Not so good on other issues, immigration, etc. How do you think, with Biden as opposed to Hillary, some of those classical liberal libertarians who weren't sure about Trump will vote?
Biden's more scary on everything. I mean, Biden's record, he has no civil liberties track record. He has no, Biden, to get this job and keep it, has told the labor unions they get anything they want, the teachers union, they get anything they want, the trial lawyers, they get everything they want, the government workers, the big city police, the big city machines.
Right.
There's nothing a libertarian could look at that would get through that sieve.
Okay, let's move on. Robin Edwards, will the massive injection of liquidity and super low interest rates eventually lead to a substantial rise in equity and real estate as post-2008?
Possibly. The biggest change that's going to happen is when the president, by executive order, indexed the cost basis of capital for calculating capital gains taxes. So you no longer tax the inflation in the value of a home, a building, stock, a business. That is something the president has endorsed several times. I believe he will pull the trigger on that between now and the election. Okay,
a question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think it's likely that the employment payouts, $600 a week, maybe we should say unemployment payouts, will be extended beyond August if there is a spike in cases or deaths around that time? And if so, what do you think the ramifications of that would be?
If that $600 is extended, unemployment will not drop. It'll continue at very high levels, and the president will lose the election in a landslide. Therefore, I think he won't sign his death bill.
Next question from Philippa Noble. If your argument for medical deregulation is a positive here, would you extend that to normal times as well? Or is this a measure for the crisis only, due to the high death rate here compared to the potential safety issues that could be flagged up by extra but slower precautions?
Extremely good question. But the answer is we were deregulating in that direction before the virus. Before, you saw a state like Arizona saying, we recognize all licenses from other 49 states, just come to our state, you're in. all licensed, not matter of fact, they left some of the medical stuff out of that one, okay? And now Ohio's largely done the same thing. And now states are going, we're going to speed up this whole process of doctors and nurses across state lines permanently. It makes no sense not to. The crisis made that clearer. So I think on medical, telecommunications is the other one, because you can travel across state lines on the phone or on Zoom, for crying out loud. That also, we're finally updating the laws to catch up with technology, because telephones have been around for a number of years now, and we haven't updated our telecommunications medicine laws.
Yeah, very interesting debate there. The IA is we'll be writing more stuff on this. The issue of the precautionary principle, has it become the over precautionary principle as compared to the innovation principle? And should we be, understanding that you can't really regulate away all risk and you have to take some risk? Next question from an anonymous attendee. Is there any outcome that will convince you Michigan did it right?
Oh, it would be hard to convince me that arresting people for being in a boat in the middle of a lake qualifies as doing something right, because that didn't solve any problems. We'll see how they do with their economy. We'll see how they do with fighting the whole effort. But the attacks on some of the more extreme things that have happened in Michigan have nothing to do with helping the virus. So I see no bonus points for being so extreme that you did unnecessary damage to people's freedom.
Okay, next question from Christopher Marshall. A coalition of anti-capitalists is agitating to extend the lockdown indefinitely by stressing the importance of safety. How can we effectively argue in favor of risk? Good question, Christopher, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. That is the fight. I mean, we're going to argue, we're going to end up in love with the precautionary principle or end up with an innovative society. I'm betting that we go with the innovative ones. And the reason we're going to win is that innovation is a better thing than the precautionary principle. And because of the United States, we're allowing 50 states to innovate. And the faster the president gives all decisions to the states and says, you guys decide, the faster we'll recognize the difference between success and failure. The more people see that, this is a learning moment. It's as if in dealing with the Great Depression, we'd let some states have a 25% federal income tax and some states have a 75% federal income tax instead of having everybody live under 75%. My guess is we'd have learned to have avoided 9 out of the 10 to 20 years of the Great Depression by having that kind of comparison. It's when you can't compare the United States to, you can't go and say, well, in Ghana, they do it this way. It just doesn't, you can't, first of all, nobody knows where Ghana is. But in the United States, Canada, vaguely, it's to the north. But people do get the other 49 states, and they will learn from the other 49 states if they won't from other countries.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Nick Simoncini. Do you have any concerns surrounding legislation stemming from the pandemic that could negatively impact individual privacy rights? What are your thoughts on the role of big tech companies and how they should be handled?
I think the goal is to leave the big companies alone and allow people companies to say, here's our privacy rules, and to compete on better privacy rules to the extent that people really want that.
Okay, thanks so much. Just to let you know, you're back. Okay, great. Let me just see, sorry, next question. We might get through them all. If not, I apologize to the last anonymous attendee. Sorry, answer live, done that. Right, could Grover speak more on the contents of Pelosi's bill and why he disagrees?
Well, it's just being laid out. It's $1 trillion to failed cities and states. To people who've spent too much money in the past, not to do anything to deal with the virus at all. It's just an excuse there. She has in the past, I can just go through what she's been asking for in the past. This new one, I'm not up to speed on exactly what's there. She wanted the Green New Deal, which was massive subsidies to make-believe energy. She wants to tax real energy. She is looking for minimum wages that put teenagers and people trying to get their first employment out of operations. She wants to give powers to labor unions to also limit the number of people who can work in order to keep wages in certain areas artificially exploited. I mean, everything she wants the trial lawyers to be able to sue everybody around, and she wants to change election law to make fraud easier. So those are all bad ideas. If she had a good idea, passed it.
Okay, and that brings us to the last question. Thank you very much, Grover. You've been fantastic on this. Isn't homeschooling unfair to children? How can they be prepared for the world if they grow up all sheltered at home?
Well, several things. Homeschoolers have better social skills than non-homeschoolers. This stuff has been tested. They know more about the world than people who go to public schools. My kids go to public schools. It's amazing what they don't know. The sheltering within a government-run school and what you're told about and not told about is kind of scary compared to what a kid can learn at home from parents. But no, we've had great success with private education, homeschooling. And again, you know, dozens of years of it being mostly legal. And if there was an argument against it that made any sense, you'd have heard it by now. Instead, you hear the success stories, you hear that what people are able to accomplish, and people do a very good job there. They're more likely to volunteer, they're more likely to be politically engaged, they're more likely to do all of the things that you think. Living at home does not mean living on a farm 50 miles away from everybody else. They get together in associations and play sports together. Homeschoolers get together and mom does one subject and somebody else does another. It's a very sophisticated, you have online learning, every bit as sophisticated as what a university would do online. It is not somebody's imagination, although the good news is Harvard is attacked it as a threat to Western civilization. So we're pretty sure it's a good idea.
Well, thank you for watching this video today. If you want to see more, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London, or follow our podcasts at Podbean. Visit our website at www.iea.org.uk, where you can also sign up for our daily e-newsletter and find out more information on the IEA Book Club.